Vielen Dank, Gil, für die freundliche Einführung und vielen Dank an alle hier in dem Raum. I'm going to switch to English now because this event is in the English language so that we can discuss together. First of all, thank you everyone for coming to this event tonight. Thank you, Ben Raif, Dana Mills, and Alain Salama from 972 Magazine. I personally am here tonight in kind of a double role because I am moderating and speaking with you guys about your work, but I also secretly, not so secretly, maybe am a writer for the 972 Magazine. So just to be precise, for the sake of transparency, this is the situation we're in tonight, but I'm very happy to discuss with you regardless. I personally feel that the work you guys have been doing over the past 3 years specifically, but also leading up to those years, have really been indispensable in order to get like an inside view on Palestine and Israel, specifically Gaza. I think that has been, in order to just set the tone for this conversation, I think that has been indispensable specifically in Germany, where we've seen tendencies and inclinations and restrictions on free speech on the streets of Berlin, but also other cities, but also inside newsrooms, inside editorial guidelines. And we've seen this use of active language versus passive language. We've seen a lot of like very kind of obvious inclinations that are indicative of what is happening in the West more broadly, I would say, on Israel-Palestine, but really feel, to an extent, extreme in Germany. And kind of to kick this off, because you're here in Germany not only for this specific evening, you've been here for a couple of days at this point. You've been to Munich, I believe. You've been in editorial newsrooms here in Berlin, and I kind of wanted to enter this discussion like fairly lightly. I just wanted to get an in from you. How has that been like? Have you had debates that kind of changed your perception on the situation in Germany vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel, or what do you take from the last few days? Maybe we can, this is a question for all of you, so maybe whoever feels inclined to respond that, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you all for coming on this lovely evening, not to be underestimated. First of all, it's been wonderful being here, and it's always specifically wonderful to be in Berlin. I think we are both surprised and encouraged and also revitalized by the debates, because we didn't know exactly what to expect. We didn't know if the way that we have interpreted and continue to discuss the last 3 years and the 70-something years that came before them, how would that be received in Germany? We have found a lot of positive reception, not only of our work, but of our discussions. And we have found, especially, I want to say, this always gives me hope, a younger generation that is very eager to push things and to change structures in which it's working. And what I feel has been energizing is the kind of, I've always believed that we can only create change both in discourse and in reality, and kind of thinking internationally and feeding from each other's discussions. And on the one hand, we have heard a lot of silencing. We have heard a lot about oppression. Obviously, we've been covering that also. Like, you write for us a lot, and we're always very grateful for that. Around policing, about the attacks on the pro-Palestine movement in Germany. But the need to push against that, and the need to do that together, I think is something that, for me at least, has been kind of very important to hear that and to think about. And I think we're already kind of having conversations about how we're going to cover this from now on. Like, how is the magazine going to respond to this challenge? And what can we do in kind of thinking about us as a kind of collective of journalists that is already international? We can talk about that later, but that is outward facing and trying to think internationally, like, what can we do to help comrades in Germany kind of go beyond the situation in which they're working? I mean, things are really horrible. We had just an internal discussion, and we had a comment about the fact that the website is really depressing. And it has been for a very long time, because the situation on the ground is really horrible. We are looking at more than 3 years of ongoing genocide, because it really hasn't stopped with the ceasefire, and it really hasn't started on the 7th of October, something that's really important for us to stress. We're looking at a huge surge of state-sponsored settler violence in the West Bank, something that really isn't covered enough in international media. We're looking at what's happening in Lebanon. Just today I saw quite a few breaking news around that, bombardment of civilian population, displacement, etc. So we need to, in order to counter that, in order to think about how to create resistance, that we really need to, I think, to think internationally. So it's been helpful to be here for that.
Can I just I want to hear all of your positions on this, and just a very minor sidebar, because I forgot this at the beginning. Anyone who speaks German and who wants translation, there are audio devices outside if you feel you need translation. There are translators here in this booth, and they're doing remarkable work. I just want to pick up very quickly on what you said, because I heard a few words that are leading me to think, you said change and you said resistance. These are not words we usually hear in newsrooms kind of, lightly. Aren't we the objective lighthouse bystanders who look on things and are sort of quote unquote neutral? How do you kind of navigate these kind of terms in your work?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're a media organization, so journalism comes first for us. We never compromise on the journalistic integrity of our work. We maintain the highest standards also because we know that we're under more scrutiny because of our politics. But alongside, this utmost journalistic integrity, we also have a very kind of clear and pronounced set of values that inform all of our work and that dictate how we cover the situation in Israel-Palestine. And that is, a commitment above all to human rights. And that's regardless of who we're talking about. That's Palestinians, Israelis, it doesn't matter. It's a commitment first and foremost to human rights. And it's also an analysis that informs our coverage, which is an analysis that when 972 was founded in 2010 was not popular at all in the international media landscape. And that is the fact that between the river and the sea, we have a one-state reality and a situation of apartheid where Israeli Jews, no matter where they live, have privileges that Palestinians, no matter where they live, do not enjoy, right? And I think a lot of people, when we say that, accuse us of being activists, of being we're not neutral, we're not objective. How is that journalism? I think our response to that is there is not a newsroom in the world that is objective or neutral. Every day, editors and reporters make choices about what they want to cover and how they want to cover it. They make choices about the language they use to cover those things. They make choices about who they give an interview to, which sources they rely on in that coverage. So I think, we don't see ourselves as objective because we think no media is objective, but we're very clear about what our values are in a way that I think a lot of media organizations are not.
I sympathize with what you just said in terms of kind of doing away, if I rephrase it slightly, with this sort of notion of objectivity that kind of looms over journalism and I would say is inclined against people on the left more broadly. But still, how do you navigate tensions in the newsroom? Because you also you are famously a binational Jewish Palestinian partnership organization that works with Palestinians on the ground, not just in 48 Israel, but also from within the West Bank and from Gaza as well, and actually from the broader region. So how do you navigate potential tensions within the newsroom and also more broadly the kind of discussions that erupt around terminology or language, all that?
Again, like Ben said, we have a very clear set of values that I think it's impossible for someone to work with Plus 972 without subscribing to these values. And once you do, there's very little tension. And that's not to say there are no discussions, but as soon as you say we are completely committed to human rights, as soon as you say we are completely committed to freedom and justice between the river and the sea and for the broader region, then there's really just, it's very difficult to have disagreements about core issues after that. for example, the use of the word apartheid has been part of 972's work for as long as I can remember. And how can it not be something that we all agree on within the team if we are living this reality and we are seeing this reality and we are reporting on this reality, and we would like to be honest both with ourselves and with our audience? Some things are very clear, and the attempt to make them seem more nuanced or more complex is in itself being biased and is in itself trying to hide sometimes very obvious facts. And we try our best to just steer clear from that completely.
And when you do sort of, because 972 at this point on a regular basis is doing investigative work. I mean, some of the work you've been publishing has honestly been, it's been quoted in ICJ documents. It's been going around the world as leading examples of uncovering examples for why there is a genocide ongoing in Gaza. The first thing that comes to mind is Yuval Abraham's research on AI targeting system used in Gaza. But also other reports on sexual violence against Palestinian detainees and many other things that have really been spearheading at a time when many other newsrooms wouldn't yet speak about these things that explicitly. Like when you do these kind of investigations with international outlets, is there sometimes a kind of sort of slight clash of approach for how you go, like in The Guardian, for example, or do these things come up?
No, I would say, so we have a very close working relationship with The Guardian as of the last 2.5 years, particularly their investigations team. So we have a very small investigations team. The Guardian has a much bigger investigations team. That's both particularly the UK newspaper, but also the team in the US that we work closely with. Sometimes, I think, particularly in the last year or so, a lot of those investigations have been conceived of completely jointly and worked on completely jointly and published completely jointly. Earlier on, it was a little bit more that, we would do a lot of the early work and the research, and they might add a little bit here and there, and then we publish. Often, we have a different audience than The Guardian, and The Guardian have different, a different mission than we do that guides their journalism. And so usually we publish a draft on 972 magazine, they publish a draft on The Guardian, and it's not the same. We emphasize different things that we think is more important for our audience. Usually that means focusing more on the kind of nitty-gritty of what's happening on the ground in Israel-Palestine, and for The Guardian it's a little bit more of an international focus or a kind of diplomatic focus. But no, we're very aligned with the investigations team at The Guardian, that's for sure. I think, if we were to be working with, the senior editorial staff more broadly, I think that, sure, there might be more tensions coming up there, but the investigations team at The Guardian for sure is very aligned with us.
Just to add briefly, when 972 was founded in 2010, one of its core goals was to push the international discourse and journalistic discourse specifically around Israel and Palestine, and to challenge how the mainstream media had portrayed the region. And what we're seeing, especially over the last 3 years, is that a lot of the mainstream media and the liberal media has caught up. And I mean, one example, you were talking about the Lavender investigation. So when we published it, was published on the 30th of November, 2023, so very shortly after the 7th of October. And at first we got a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance and kind of doubting both our method and the findings, etc. By the end of 2024, both the New York Times and the Washington Post had referred to Gaza as the first AI war, which means that they completely assimilated our findings into the discourse more broadly about that year.
Were you credited, or?
No, of course not. But for us, that's kind of the mission, and I think it's interesting for us to work now in a media landscape in which, again, like the pushback we're getting is different. It's not necessarily around these kind of core values and the issues that we're raising, but again, in kind of different ways.
Dana, you're kind of on board with the magazine for a bit longer than the two of you, right?
Ben is the longest
serving.
Really? Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so this is a question to all of you again. When I came to Israel-Palestine first and worked as a reporter first, which was back in 2011, like 15 years ago at this point, 972 existed, but it was something somewhat differently. It felt, to me personally, and I'm not claiming, to know it all, but like it seemed as if it's kind of like a niche-y sort of blog for the Israeli left, partly also the Palestinian left, but it significantly changed over the years into like a much more serious, as you say, investigative working outlet. How do you see this change?
So basically, 972 was founded in 2010 by a group of Israeli bloggers who wanted to push the discourse, as I said, wanted to kind of challenge mainstream discourse. But they were bloggers, they had a day job, they did it in their free time, they were not journalists. What has happened, two things happened very quickly. One kind of longer, but one very quickly. The first thing was the fact that it became binational. And since that moment, it had always stayed binational. It's one of the most important core values for the outlet, which actually makes it very different to a lot of other progressive outlets that cover the region. And it does give our work a specific edge that I think, and a specific advantage in how we see and how we interpret the region.
Can you just like spell it out for a minute, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, what that actually means?
Yeah, so it means that in every stage of the editorial process, from writing to editing to commissioning to final decisions to social media to photos, everything is done by both Jews and Palestinians together. And I think often we see in organizations that say that they're binational, that it's still, there's a division of labor, and there's still kind of, there are certain issues that are not open to, especially I should say, it kind of reproduces systems of power, which means that Jews will still have kind of the last word. And with us, it is something that we really take as we have to have a conversation that is equal on all levels of the editorial process. And I do think that it means, I mean, there is, as Allah said, we agree on core values. We agree that human rights should come before anything else. I know that nowadays in some circles that's considered radical, but that says something about our world and not our position. But we do have disagreements. I do want to also say it's not that we all sit and sing Kumbaya and agree on everything. On the International or something, but we do kind of work through those disagreements, and very often we will publish pieces, and some people might be less pleased with a specific piece, and other people will be less pleased with another piece.
Can you name an example of such a disagreement, maybe?
Oh, so many. I don't know. I think in the end we do kind of come around and understand. I think even if we don't agree from our core, we do understand the logic, and we learn a lot, I think, from these conversations. And I think, yeah, I mean, when we think about the left broadly, because we do kind of identify as part of the left, one of the things that I think we're really bad on the left is to hold disagreement and to work through things that we don't, all agree 100% on every little part of what we do. So I think we're really good at that at the magazine, and we're good at kind of sustaining friendships, sustaining good working relationships, and still being like, yeah.
But again, the core values are the same, and they need to be the same. And I can give you an example of where we differ in opinions. For example, when it's a luxury, but when we talk about solutions, for example, the core values are freedom, justice, and equality. But Miron Rapaport, for example, can push for what they call one homeland, two nations. Yeah. Whereas I believe in one nation between the river and the sea. But the core value is the same. It's that we want freedom and human rights for the people who find themselves by some cosmic miracle to be living between the river and the sea. And we agree also on the right of return, for example. That's non-negotiable for us, but that's like rare when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian partnership. So the core values are the same.
Of Palestinian refugees expelled during the Nakba of 48. Right. Yeah. Since you know everything about audience engagement at 972, I'm wondering, we've spoken...
stretch.
Say again?
That's a stretch.
I assume you do. We've spoken a little bit about the production side of the magazine, but I'm obviously very curious, who is it actually tailored to? You work from within 48 Israel proper, in English. Of course, much of the content is translated to the Hebrew sister outlet, Sicha Mekumit, but local call. But I find it remarkable that 972 the magazine is quoted all over the place in Germany, in the US, and other places. Who do you have in mind when you publish, say, an investigation or an article, and what experiences do you make in that regard?
We're very practical when it comes to thinking about our audience. Much of the global discussion about Palestine and Israel and the broader region is done in English, and much of it falls within the influence of the United States. And that translates directly to the data that we see, which is that most of our readers are in the United States. And we also understand that the United States, not only through their relationship with Israel, but through the global hegemony that they have great influence over what happens to our local lives. And so we understand that much of our effect is going to be there. And of course, we realize now, and we see it also in data, there's so much interest in Israel, Palestine, in Europe, and we try our best to reach our audiences there. Sometimes we fail, and sometimes we do a good job, but it's primarily, and from the get-go, it was established to counter the international narratives that the people who started the magazine saw as being biased and one-sided. So that has been our mission from the start, and that's what we've been working towards.
Well, if you look at the continuing biases in international reporting on Israel-Palestine, I think you might be hopeful that like the magazine is going to be read more. Especially when you look at the Israeli media environment, it's quite remarkable. And I think many of the people, international audience, often don't know this because they don't speak Hebrew. But when you look at something like Channel 14, which really dominated discourse in Israel, it seems to me it's a far-right outlet that like has produced a lot of really inciting and propaganda over the past years. What do you think? Are there allies within the Israeli media environment that you feel like you can work with? And despite Haaretz, how does this work?
So the situation within Israeli media is depressing because a lot of the tendencies towards the far right, and I think your observation is correct, and it's not only Channel 14, but a lot of the mainstream media, is actually not legally or politically enforced. So when a lot of the things that have come up in our conversations here have been kind of, is the legislation that limits freedom of press? Are there sanctions on freedom of speech, etc.? And the truth is that not really. I mean, it's actually, the stakes are fairly low in Israel to be dissenting. And Local Call, Sicha Mekomit, is a website that was founded in 2014. By the way, both websites, 972 and Local Call, are very much related to Israeli offenses on Gaza. So both were kind of related to how those were portrayed internationally and locally. And Local Call is fairly alone in its voice and in sort of both, obviously publishing those investigations, but also reporting from the ground, both from the West Bank and from Gaza, as well as sort of writing what we call voices of conscience, so dissent against militarism, against fascism, etc. We're very much alone in that. And I mean, we do work sometimes with Haaretz, especially I would say around coverage of the West Bank and sort of on the ground. But mostly a lot of the other things, not so much. And I think the media landscape is very right-wing and has, especially since October 7th, I can describe, I'm based in Tel Aviv, and I can describe, for instance, reporters went with the military into Gaza. So you might know that international journalists are not allowed to go into Gaza still. I will say in parenthesis that there have been journalists in Gaza all throughout since October 7th and way before that. Because Palestinian voices are very often belittled and are not believed. Those have been kind of omitted from international press. We have brought in both outlets voices from the ground from Gaza from day one of the Israeli genocide. But Israeli reporters joined the military, went sometimes in army uniform, sometimes on a tank, into Gaza, into Lebanon, and that kind of gives you an image of the coverage on how media sees itself. It sees itself as part of the government rather than something that is supposed to challenge it. And militarism in Israel is so entrenched that it really is something that is so consensual that very few people within, I would say even liberal or left-wing media, try to challenge it apart from us.
I think it's worth emphasizing as well, after October 7th, Local Call in Hebrew, which is 972's kind of sister site, was the only Hebrew language media site in Israel that opposed the war from day one. I say the only one. I think Haaretz is often held up as like a bastion of liberal media inside Israel. Haaretz, for a long time, was pretty uniformly in support of the war after October 7th. It rallied around the flag, as much as every other media outlet did. Slowly, in the weeks and months that followed, it became a little bit more dissenting and started publishing more voices against the war. But it took a while. Local Call, which is our Hebrew sister site, was the only site that was opposing the war from day one, which I think just, speaks to how lonely this landscape is.
But I've heard that a lot from colleagues working on the ground in Israel-Palestine, but how do you actually explain that? Is that like institutional pressure from within the newsrooms? Is that trauma, or is it just fear on part of the colleagues? Like, what's behind this?
Yeah, no. This is what Dana was saying. There's absolutely nothing stopping Israeli media from reporting on what's happening to the Palestinians. There's absolutely nothing. There are no repercussions, legal or otherwise. They can do the right thing. They can report on it, but that doesn't happen, and it's a choice. And that choice goes. It goes down deep. We understand that in Israel, it begins in kindergartens where children are brought up to believe in the army, to believe in the Israeli Defense Force, to believe in Zionism, to believe that it's either they're at war all the time or their lives are in danger, and it just goes all the way to the top. And no, Israeli media has the option of not falling in line, of not rallying around the flag, but that never happens, and that's not about media, that's about society, because we also understand that the Israeli society, there is a consensus within the Jewish Israeli society when it comes to the Palestinians. There's lots of voices that oppose the government or that oppose Netanyahu or that talk about corruption, but when it comes to the Palestinians, there's a consensus. There are dissenting voices, but they are very, very rare.
Just to add to that, there is so you might have heard that there is a crackdown on press by the government, but the truth is that for the vast majority of Israeli Jewish public, talking about apartheid, talking about Palestinians is not of interest. So Jewish supremacy is so entrenched that it's not contested at all. And one of the interesting things about Local Call is that it goes under the radar because it really is not of interest, even to the government. So a lot of the crackdown on press and a lot of the legislation around freedom of press is against newspapers that deal with corruption or deal with the rule of law, because that's seen as a threat to the government. What we do, unpacking genocide, unpacking apartheid, is not a threat because it has very little resonance in the wider society.
Well, we were kind of joking about this last night. In Germany, I think often when people speak about the Israeli left, what they have in mind is the kind of anti-autocracy movement that protested against the judicial reform 3 years ago, that are spearheaded by kind of mid-center liberal figures like Gallant and Yair Lapid and others. But actually, when you kind of compress the Israeli left, maybe you could you could actually summarize it in a big WhatsApp group. That was kind of the joke yesterday. But like, I'm wondering, so it's just a reflection maybe of public sentiment to some degree as well, that we don't see this in the media. That just like there's not enough people in Israel at the moment that are voicing positions like yours.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, it's an interesting example, the anti-government demonstrations in 2023 that, ran pretty much weekly until October 7th. And these were very powerful demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets, some of the biggest protests in Israel's history. I was living in Israel, Palestine when these started, and I remember reporting on what was called the anti-occupation bloc within these protests. So the protests, maybe it's worth explaining, were about the current Israeli government was elected at the end of 2022. They came in with an agenda. It's the most far-right government in Israel's history, which came in with an agenda not only to kind of intensify its oppression of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and inside Israel, but also to crack down on the judiciary inside Israel and kind of dismantling the nominal democratic structures that exist for Israeli Jews as well as for Palestinians. Now, this generated a lot of protest, as Dana said, because this is an issue that Israeli Jews care about. So suddenly everyone was out into the streets. And these protests, to kind of describe them in a few words, that it was like a flood of Israeli flags, right? They were incredibly nationalist protests. Now, the anti-occupation bloc, or the radical bloc as it kind of became known later, were a handful of radical left activists who, instead of submitting to this wave of nationalism that defined this protest, stood there with Palestinian flags and signs that said, there's no democracy with occupation. We're protesting in support of democracy here. How can you talk about democracy when 5-6 million Palestinians live without any rights, without any right to determine the government that rules over their lives and has done for 70 years, or for less time if we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza. And the treatment that this bloc received at these protests was unbelievable. I mean, there were beatings, there were people chased out of the streets for holding Palestinian flags. And this was, a minority among a minority at a protest. And I think that treatment is indicative of what the Israeli left kind of quote unquote looks like today.
Yeah, I remember very strikingly that some of the pilots that refused to fly in protest to this looming judicial reform later on didn't refuse to fly when it came to retaliation against Gaza. You want to add to that?
Just to say, in continuation to that, one of the arguments around the judicial reform was also who will protect you when the ICC comes for you, and like when the international criminal courts will come for these pilots. So the idea was like to defend internally so that the war crimes committed will have more impunity.
Right. I think talking about Israel-Palestine journalism on these issues during the genocide and the conditions we're facing these days would be, I would be remiss not to mention the fact that over 200 media workers and journalists have been killed in Gaza, and so many outlets, I think, especially in Western countries like Germany, could have done such a better job at simply talking to those guys earlier and kind of basically doing what Al Jazeera has been doing from the get-go, and also what you have been doing. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a little bit of some concrete insights on how that actually worked, because it's obviously extreme conditions to do journalism from within Gaza, and when you have people giving you accounts, like was that particularly hard? How did you verify information? How did you go about working with journalists in Gaza?
So I want to say that, first of all, our work with our journalists in Gaza was not just around the stories, but basically we had freelancers writing for us before October 7th. And after October 7th, our editor-in-chief, Rusun Bisharat, basically put together a team of freelancers with whom she kept in touch every day, just to make sure they were okay, making sure they have access to SIM cards, they have access to internet, very basic things that were attacked. Infrastructure in Gaza was attacked several times, very intentionally to stop the flow of information outside. I think it was very clear to Israeli authorities that this is, this is something that needs to be targeted, and we did the best we could to ensure that these things were available to our correspondents. It has been incredibly difficult for them. And I mean, a lot of the reports that we were sent, we had one report that was written literally under rubble, sort of a reporter that his house was collapsing on him, and he wrote about that experience. Most of our reporters had lost I think all of our reporters had lost significant number of family members and had reported on that. We hold our journalism, as Ben said, that's like our central ethos. We hold our journalism to the highest standard, and we continue to fact check, we continue to work with them throughout the editorial process. Sometimes we had to wait for days because they had no access to internet. But that has been ongoing throughout. But I think for us, it was also, Rusun did an incredible job in so many ways, but even just to keep in touch with our reporters throughout these 2 or 3 years. And also for those who wish to leave the Strip to be part of that process. Because, part of the definition of genocide is to make a certain area unlivable and uninhabitable. It was very clear that this attack, beyond sort of targeting various parts of infrastructure, including cultural infrastructure, including domicide, something that we wrote about and then The Guardian wrote about as well. There was kind of sustained attack on all elements of life in the Strip. So many of our reporters wished to leave, and then we were also involved in that process. And again, in touch with them until sort of on the other side, and still in touch. And sort of a lot of them are now writing for us about life, a year or 2 years after leaving and what it means for them. Many of them also have many family members who left, who remained in the Strip. So all these elements kind of fed into the journalistic work we did. And yeah, I think it's really humbling to sort of see I encourage you, we do have a tab on our website that says Gaza, and you can see reporting going back and how that develops, and it is really humbling to see.
Much of what we've seen, the images we've seen from Gaza and the images we continue to see from both Gaza and the West Bank are images we receive first on social media, and then they kind of often sort of trickle down into somewhat more structured reporting afterwards. And I personally, as a freelancer who uses social media, have been really struggling with that tension, what that actually means. Like, how do you kind of employ it for your work? How do you sort of, where do you rely on information you see on social media or not? I'm curious, how do you deal with that kind of tension, and how do you use social media in order to amplify the work or in order to gather information? Like, how has that been?
But again, this whole concern with journalists on the ground in Gaza or the West Bank, it stems from somewhere that is weird to me. Because yes, international journalists are not allowed into Gaza, but Gaza has journalists. And if I have a reporter in Tanzania and he sends me a report, I'm not going to go make sure the information is correct. That is his job. And so we trust our reporters in Gaza, we trust our reporters in the West Bank, and it's their job, and it's our we need to trust them, we need to believe them, which is exactly what we did, and which is exactly what the international media refused to do, which is incredible. And we know that in German media, there are almost no Palestinian voices, and in fact, we understood today that there are almost no Jewish anti-Zionist voices even. So it's completely one-sided, and I think there's a lot of intrinsic racism in thinking that I need a British reporter in Gaza in order to get accurate information when Gaza has journalists. Same for the West Bank. The West Bank has plenty of journalists and reporters and photographers and videographers that it's very easy to get the information that we need to get. And everywhere we go, everywhere we meet journalists, we say, trust the journalists of Gaza, trust the Palestinian journalists, because those are the ones whose lives are at stake, who have worked despite everything that they went through, and there's just absolutely no reason not to trust them. Yeah.
I want to add something from the mirror image of that, which is, I think that genocide in Gaza is the first to be live streamed. And a lot of what has been going on maybe is not new. A lot of the war crimes we're seeing are not new, but they are put there by the perpetrators on their Instagram accounts, on their Facebook accounts. I'm talking about Israeli soldiers who document war crimes and put them out there under their name for everyone to see. And I mean, we are often asked about our sources and how we get people to talk to us about what they do. The truth is that there's so much impunity for Israeli soldiers within Israeli society and beyond it, that people just put what they're doing out there on social media. So as Allah says, we have the tendency to say, but we need to double check what Palestinians say and how they react to social media. On the other hand, war crimes, crimes against humanity are on people's Instagram accounts. Anyone can investigate, all the kind of discussion around ICC warrants and warrants around war crimes. It's all there, and people are very much boastful around that. And I'll give one example from our work. We published quite early on investigation on looting, on how Israeli soldiers went into Palestinian private homes and stole property in broad daylight and documented themselves. This was done a lot through Instagram, through people's videos that were there under their private names and for anyone to see. And it just took someone to go and find them and then write about them. But that shows you how open all these things are and how little scrutiny there is of actually the perpetrator's side on social media.
Sort of saying, even if you don't trust Palestinians, trust Israelis in their own accounts of what they're doing.
Trust everyone.
No, of course. That was a cynical comment, just to make that.
maybe I can just add on that as well. I think, a lot of our investigations relied on sources inside the Israeli army, whether it was soldiers on the ground or whether it was intelligence officers who were responsible for directing the deadliest attacks, aerial bombing campaigns. But we never relied on Israeli military sources at the expense of Palestinian testimonies. And I think that's not something that can be said for a lot of the international media. I think, a lot of the international media, we're 2.5 years into this now, and by now, almost every major media outlet has published a story relying on the testimonies of Israeli soldiers. This is what we did in Gaza, this is how we killed, this is how we destroyed, this is, what it looked like. Palestinians were saying that from day one, right? It was very important to us to bring those testimonies from Palestinians, written by Palestinian reporters who had seen it with their own eyes and collected these testimonies. It's a shame, and it's representative, I think, of the racism that's inherent in the international media coverage of Israel-Palestine, that so many of the biggest outlets in the world waited until they could, verify this from, the mouths of Israeli soldiers themselves, when Palestinians were saying it years earlier.
Well, famously in Germany, one journalist colleague who's actually here tonight, Fabian Goldman, wrote an entire book about this. German news outlets have spent a very long time, and partially do so to this day, to quote Israeli military sources, especially in news agency reports, as facts. I think that's also, to strengthen your point, it almost sounded euphemistic. Like there's not a lack of due diligence. It's just, it really is a misrepresentation of facts. But we can discuss this further. I'm going to say this now as well. I'm coming to my end of my questions. We're very much inviting you to think about your questions already. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask them in a minute. But I do still want to ask a few more things. One is, since you mentioned those media failures internationally, how do you because journalism in and of itself as a profession seems to be in somewhat of a crisis following the past 3 years. There is a real understanding, I think, among many colleagues that there's been so many things that went wrong. How can we kind of fix this? How can we ask for accountability? And how do you see your role in that?
I agree. I think journalism is in crisis in a big way. And I think it's a crisis of its own making, of the making of big corporate legacy media institutions that have obscured reality for so long, to the extent that people now can bypass them by, seeing the videos from Gaza, seeing what's happening on the ground with their own eyes every day when they wake up and scroll through social media, while, then they look in the newspaper or look on the main news channel on TV in whichever country you're sitting, and that reality is not being reflected back at you through the major media institutions. And I think particularly young people recognize that dissonance and that gap and are moving away from big legacy media organizations. We're seeing now like a resurgence of independent media like 972, but we're now in a much more kind of crowded field than we were 16 years ago when the outlet was established. Now, we sit alongside Dropsite and Zeteo and Mondoweiss and all of these outlets that do excellent reporting themselves on Israel-Palestine, on much broader issues, and I think are reflecting reality in a way that legacy media isn't, corporate media isn't, because of the interests of owners of these big publications. So I think independent media is definitely a model that I think should grow. I think should be we rely on reader funding. It needs to be funded more, and I think that's kind of one way out of this quagmire.
Strengthen independent media. Mm-hmm. Do you want to add to this, or any of you?
I don't know. It's a huge question, but I think journalism is in crisis because the world is in crisis, and I think we're living in a post-truth age, supposedly. But I do think that what we do and what journalists must continue doing is insisting on the truth, even in an age in which those videos who get the most hits or influencers who say something might attract a lot of attention. And the other thing is to talk about all the stuff we've been talking about, such as the silencing of Palestinian voices, not believing in Palestinian journalists. I think is just part of a world order that is crumbling, that has prioritized certain voices at the expense of others for many, many, many years. And that being challenged, again, from various different avenues is something that has to be incorporated into journalism. So I think the kind of media outlets that are all white, all kind of a certain representation, cannot exist anymore. And they don't talk to people who are looking for news. And I think those changes need to sort of echo up, as it were. And also to think about how the world should look and what journalism should do within this kind of new world order. I think, one thing that has been coming up in all our discussions so far is the huge emphasis on arms, Germany's role in selling arms to Israel. Also, I would say the great militarization in Europe, obviously also in relation to Russia, Ukraine, and all of that, but kind of challenging that and thinking about what journalism should do in such a moment. I mean, we have enough lessons we can learn from of moments in which we should have maybe made that more obvious to people where the world is going and what they should be doing about that and what they should be asking of their governments to do. So I think that there is something there that can be taken further.
Germany, since you mentioned it, the world is in crisis, but Germany is a liberal democracy after all. At least it purports to be, and is very proud of that. And however, when we look at the streets, when we look at activism, we look at also journalism, I would argue personally, or we look at also the sphere of culture, art, and academia, we've seen countless cancellations and of events, of jobs, of other things, for people speaking up about Gaza, about Palestine, about related issues. It's almost become kind of like a litmus test for free speech in Germany, I would say. Do you see kind of echoes vis-a-vis what is happening in Israel on free speech and similar matters when you look at the German situation, or do you think it's more extreme here?
I actually think it's more extreme here than in Israel, which says something about the Israeli climate and the German climate. I think it's actually easier to speak up against the government on its treatment of Palestinians, on apartheid and on genocide in Israel than it is currently in Germany, at least in terms of legal and political kind of consequences. There might be social pressures, etc., but if if you lose a friend over standing up for human rights, I'm guessing that's not a huge price to pay. But I do think I kind of am taking your question to a different perspective. I think this is not coincidental. I think Gaza has been the greatest moral crisis of our time. And, you know, if you ask people who were politicized in the 80s, they would talk about South Africa, and they would talk about the boycott, and they would talk about that moment as being really important for their political education. We know what happened to that generation when they went on. And for me, if we look at what's happening right now, I think it's not coincidental that young people are saying, you know, this is a moment we can't let pass. And I think the problem is that the rest of us, meaning the older generation, the structures that are in place, are not catching up and are trying to silence something that is obviously not going to be silenced. You know, those people who have been on the streets and sort of standing in solidarity for human rights, for Gaza, they're not going to go away, and they're not going to be silenced. And I think there's something about this kind of very heavy-handed policing that is obviously very scary, but also seems to be very futile. Because in the end of the day, you know, we heard quite a lot about opinion polls in Germany. We heard a lot about how the support for Israel that has been always taken for granted is now changing. I think it's again, both very violent and also very silly to think that you can actually just make this go away. And for me, you know, what we have seen over the last 3 years, it's not only a political crisis, it's a moral crisis. If you can see children being starved to death and think that it's complicated, then it's not about politics anymore.
Since you mentioned boycott, I'll just take this as a kind of leading word for a minute. There are obviously resonances, and there is a boycott movement. Germany has passed a non-legally binding resolution declaring the BDS movement as anti-Semitic for reasons of historical resonance. You as an outlet are BDS compliant, which I'm curious what that actually means. Like you get no state funding, but you're based in Israel. Maybe you can speak about that a little bit. Like I've heard critiques of 972 from the left as well. We don't speak about these kind of critiques a lot in Germany, I think, because we're so kind of overwhelmed with the ones from the right. But what does this kind of BDS compliance mean for the magazine and the work?
Yeah, BDS has very clear guidelines, but also it has it lives as we just wrote someone just wrote in the magazine. It lives in the spirit of Palestinian liberation, and that is the core value of the work that we do. Plus 972's work includes Jews from all over the world, Palestinians from all over the world, and Israelis who stand for Palestinian rights. We can list the core values of BDS, but there's clear ways to go around them. And I think that the main thing is that BDS aims to support the liberation of the Palestinian people, and that's what we stand for. We obviously get criticism. We obviously make mistakes. I have to say this, and sometimes not all of us are on board with certain things, but I think a lot of the criticisms that we do get are not very helpful, and they tend to alienate some of the staff. We are very committed to the core values that we have, and we continue to be committed, and we continue to support BDS because we believe that it's one of the most important tools that the Palestinians and the international community has to pressure Israel and to get to a point where the Palestinians have their rights. And this is part of what we talk about when we talk about the future of the magazine, for example. We know that Israel is pushing for laws that would criminalize anyone calling for sanctions against Israel from within Israel. And that's at the core of what we do. And at that point, we wouldn't be able to continue from within Israel as we have so far. But yeah, we see it as a tool, and we see the spirit of it, and we're completely committed to it.
Just to, I'll give it to you in a minute, just to understand, like if Kai Wegner was in the room with us tonight, the mayor of Berlin, and would kind of outrageously scream into the audience, well, these people support BDS, let's get them out of the city. Is this a reaction you don't even take seriously anymore, the kind of accusation of anti-Semitism that in response to BDS support, because that is very common in this environment that we're here in?
It's not. I mean, this is something that we've been discussing since morning. The weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism is harmful, first and foremost, to Jewish people around the world. And of course, anti-Semitism exists all over the world. And of course, it exists in the left. And of course, many people who profess support for Palestine are either anti-Semitic or they have, like, their whole spiel is anti-Semitism. That's possible. But to accuse people working for the liberation of the Palestinian people and calling for equal rights, which is something that if I was calling for anywhere else in the world, nobody would bat an eye, to call this sort of thing, or to accuse people who call for that with anti-Semitism, is harmful, because it lessens the value of the very real problem that is anti-Semitism. And we're seeing this in Germany, and we're seeing the definition of anti-Semitism that Germany seems to be adopting, where it equates any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and it is harmful to everyone, but it's especially harmful to Jewish people who do suffer from anti-Semitism. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous, and I think even entertaining that is just wrong.
I also want to say that BDS in South Africa was a mode of non-violent resistance, and is still one of the central ways to show non-violent resistance and solidarity with Palestine. The fact that it's being criminalized really means that there's no other way to resist. So I think if you succumb to the idea that BDS is in some way harmful or anti-Semitic, you're basically saying there's no way to resist anymore.
Maybe I can just add as well, just kind of back to the original question about criticism from the left. Look, I think BDS emerged, this was in the early 2000s, in response to a kind of vacuum of Palestinian leadership. And that vacuum was deliberately engineered by Israel, right? Which has systematically, assassinated Palestinian leaders. And, we have a very popular piece on our website from 2024 about the ways that successive Israeli governments deliberately strengthened Hamas in the decades leading up to October 7th in order to act as a kind of counterweight to the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, in order to segment the Palestinian national movement and to splinter it both politically and geographically between the West Bank and Gaza after 2005. BDS emerged into that void in order to put forward some very basic principles for Palestinian liberation that would kind of, build a consensus in order to take the movement forward. I think that was 20 years ago. A lot has changed in 20 years. BDS is still, the closest thing to a consensus that the Palestinian national movement has in terms of leadership. I also think it's natural that, 20 years on from those guidelines being developed, that there are people who, see the reality on the ground and are, think we need to take a more radical stance or to demand more things. I also understand that, when people have watched a genocide for 2.5 years every day, they're not that happy about the idea that, we just need to kind of like create some kind of situation where Israelis and Palestinians can live together in the future. A lot of people are much more angry than that, and I understand that. But I think what we do as a magazine and as a binational team is to show that there is a way. We call it co-resistance, right? Which is resistance by Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and Palestinians, against apartheid, against genocide, against what we see as the reality of settler colonialism between the river and the sea. And to do that in order to create a future where Palestinians and Jews can live equally, with equal rights, without any structures of oppression with one over the other. That is where we stand. There are inevitably some people who don't support that vision. I think it's a minority in the Palestine liberation movement, but it exists.
Given what you're up against, and this is my last question, just as a reminder to the audience, given what you're up against in terms of institutional pressure and a state that is increasingly moving in a fascist direction, I think that's fair to say. Is there something that gives you hope to keep going?
That's a question we ask ourselves every day. I would say two things. The first thing is I think we have no choice but to keep going. You know, the reality on the ground gets worse every day. But I think we as people who believe in human rights, who believe in the dignity of all people and the right to kind of freedom and liberation of all people, have no choice but to keep fighting for those values. We also see, you know, around the world, more and more people are joining this fight. That gives us strength. We try to strengthen that movement in return. And the other thing I would say is, you know, not to sound so kind of wishy-washy, but like we are a binational team. We are showing that there is a future in this land that is free of occupation, free of apartheid, and we try to kind of embody that spirit.
Right.
So I will take this question personally and say, you know, what gives me the energy. And I think for me, I'm based in Tel Aviv. I'm an Israeli Jew, and I feel that I'm looking at this from the wrong side of history, and I'm witnessing my people commit a genocide. Both my grandparents are from Germany, and always being here is very special and very loaded. And I don't think we have the privilege to look away. And I think, you know, if there's something we can learn from history, it's not like, let's be overcautious to protect Jews even when they're the ones committing genocides and crimes against humanity, but it's sort of ensuring that what we've learned from the 40s and obviously way before that is implemented everywhere. So I feel, you know, a lot of what we do, we don't see it as just a mechanism for change in the present. We kind of think of one day there'll be peace and reconciliation committees, and our work will be the archive that will be used to bring justice and to bring redistribution and some kind of compensation. Not that you can compensate for what has been going on. Again, I want to stress not only the last 3 years, but like 70 odd years at least of consistent ethnic cleansing. But yeah, on my side, I really feel it's kind of a moral and political imperative because of who I am.
You don't want to add to that?
Sure. I'm not a very hopeful person, and I you know, more cynical. But I mean, yeah. First of all, my team gives me hope. I have always believed that there must be good people who oppose this, and I remember when the protest against the judicial reform happened, I was astonished that there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who can go to the street and protest their government, but they're apparently okay with ethnic cleansing and occupation for over 80 years. So they can mobilize, but not for this big cause, but for their own. But I believe there must be good people, and I know now that there are good people, and I see the work that they do, and like Dana said, we are the model for what is possible. So that gives me hope, but also the fact that the Palestinian people are remaining in their land gives me hope, and we know and we understand that Israel's problem, the Zionist project's problem, is the Palestinian people, and there's just, as long as there are people, as long as there are decent people everywhere, including here in Germany, and all the millions that we saw demonstrate, Israel will not be able to take these 6 million Palestinians and throw them in the sea. And that means that Israel is fighting the wave of history, and I do not think that you can fight history and win. And just outside this building, there are remnants of a wall that I know up to 2 months before it fell, people believed it was a fact of life, and people believed that it would never fall, but it fell. And so this gives me hope, and I know that we're on the right side of history, and the right side of history will prevail. And unfortunately, that doesn't mean anything for people who have lost their lives. It doesn't mean anything for people who have lost everything. But like Ben said, we don't have the luxury of looking away. We don't have the luxury of giving up. We don't have the luxury of pretending like there's no hope and there's nothing that we can do. As long as we can do something, then we should do something, and that gives me hope.
Maybe just to add one more thing, I think we are the majority, right? There are a majority of people in the world right now who support freedom and liberation for Palestinians from Israeli occupation. That wasn't always the case, right? That's taken decades upon decades of activists and academics and thinkers and analysts and journalists and people on the ground and everyday people in their workplaces, wherever they are, to push that fight forward to get to a point where a majority of people around the world, even a majority of people in Germany, right, think that, you know, we need to completely reassess our government support for Israel. That gives me massive hope. Clearly, there's a big disconnect now between the people and our governments around the world. That's now the challenge that we need to face, is how to force action from our governments. But I think that's a much better challenge than being in a minority and trying to work out how to do that. We're in new territory now, and that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Ala, Dana, and Ben, for that. Long round of applause. Now you have the option to ask questions. I'll be happy to translate them if they're asked in German. I see someone here in front. Please, one thing before we ask the questions, I have only one request from you. Make a question mark at the end of the question. That's always helpful because that differentiates a question from a comment. Thank you. Please.
I'm reading the 972 Mac or 792, I don't know in the moment. What is your relation with this Mac? And another thing, I once have heard that a lot of the settlers in West Jordan land say that the best party in Germany is the AfD. Is that real, really? But our media is hiding it as a secret.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to respond directly, or should we collect 2 or 3? Okay, let's collect here on the left. I see 2 questions. Let's get them right away.
Firstly, thank you so much for an incredible panel. I learned a lot, and I'm very humbled by the stories that you shared. My question is that you spoke a lot about the sort of impenetrable nature of indoctrination in Israeli society and just the depth of the Jewish supremacy complex in Israel. But as a media organization operating from Israel, is there a mechanism that you see to penetrate that indoctrination? And if so, how? And if so, are you doing it?
The other one there.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much as well. I was just wondering, because like the idea of coexistence and then, but then also being on the ground and facing the reality on the ground, which is the inequality of rights for Palestinians and Israelis. And I wonder how that impacts your work. Like, for instance, for a Palestinian writer and for an Israeli writer, like the repercussions that you might face, I'm sure there are differences. And how you maybe decide who is going to write what and the repercussions that the other person might face. And I wonder how that looks like for you.
Let's do answers now, and then we collect another round of questions, yeah.
maybe I'll start with the last. We're extremely clear that we do not talk about coexistence. We talk about co-resistance, and the reason is that it's good to coexist, I think, but it's not good to coexist under an apartheid regime that treats one people as superior to another. And so under co-resistance is the understanding that we are not equal. Here we are, but as soon as we're back in Palestine, we're not equal. And we understand that, and we talk about how our reporters in Gaza have lost homes and have lost family members and have had to relocate sometimes 10 times and while still working. Sometimes they've written reports for us as they were actively looking for food and water and shelter. Our reporters in the West Bank, Bassel Adra, for example, has his home raided almost once a month at this point. So there's obviously very different circumstances that we operate under, and it is what it is, and we do our best to protect each other and to help each other, but we understand that we are not equal under an apartheid regime.
Perhaps I'll take the question on the Israeli kind of psyche and Jewish supremacy. And I mean, and this is especially true for Local Call, which is the Hebrew outlet. It's kind of like throwing things at a wall and hoping that one day it will start crumbling. And like I didn't think about the Berlin Wall, but probably that's in my head also. And I'll give you one example from the past 3 years. So as Ben said, Local Call is the only outlet that has opposed the genocide from day one, but also it's the only outlet that started translating voices from the ground from Gaza way before 7th of October, but especially after, sort of just giving testimonies and showing what is the reality to be Palestinian under genocide, under sustained military attack. Now, these stories had like minuscule numbers of readers compared to a lot of other things we publish, which is already like people who are coming to our website and they don't want to read that. A lot of what we did, as I said, like in my last question, is kind of thinking about an archive. But we did see throughout the last 3 years, so as you probably saw, there were a lot of demonstrations in Israel to free the Israeli hostages in Gaza. Most of the vast majority of those protests, just like Ben said about the judicial overhaul protests, were very nationalistic. They were only about Jewish lives. They're only about free the hostages. Some of the speeches, it was really hard because that you have family of hostages standing on stage and saying, I don't care about Palestinians in Gaza, I want my child back. And people kind of clapping along, and you kind of think, okay, but don't you understand that these two are bound in each other? The fact that the Israeli military is bombarding the Gaza Strip is obviously endangering its own people, at the very least. I'm not talking now about the bigger moral argument. But at some point, and I think it was more or less around the summer and beginning of autumn, just before the formal ceasefire was signed, you kind of saw something penetrating into mainstream Israeli discourse, and that was discourse around hunger and around starvation. Now, the terms are really important, and most people didn't talk about starvation, although obviously it was starvation. It was Israeli authorities stopping aid from coming into the Strip or letting minuscule amounts of food enter, which in a way that is insufficient. But you did see kind of more mainstream voices on the ground, in media, public voices, talking about hungry children, talking about how terrible that is. There wasn't so much responsibility of like, we are doing this, but there was a feeling of we need this to stop. And there was kind of discomfort around it. And again, it's not like the thing that I would like to see and kind of saying we are responsible and we need to ask accountability, but it was kind of penetrating the discourse and something that we've been writing about for years and years. We've been writing about restrictions to aid even before the 7th of October. Obviously, Gaza Strip has been severely, I don't know if you know, but there's actually a really famous court case in which the Israeli authorities said that they're limiting the number of calories that are allowed per person to the Gaza Strip. So, this is really not a new thing, and we've been reporting it consistently. And suddenly you kind of saw people who are really, I wouldn't say even left, saying, we actually don't want to see starving children. So again, it's like a small example, but it kind of shows that if you keep going, at the end, maybe something will trickle in.
Maybe just to add as well, I mean, Local Call does incredible work in Hebrew to try to shift this within Israeli society, often without much luck, without much success, because Israeli society is so, determined not to see Palestinians as human beings. 972 was founded by Israelis. It then became binational, but it was founded in English very deliberately because they knew that there would not be change in Israel-Palestine without international pressure. And the intention from the very beginning, which is still the intention today, is to make clear what's happening on the ground in Israel-Palestine for an international audience in order to leverage international pressure against Israel to create a situation in which there is no longer occupation and apartheid. That is still the case today. That is what drives our work. Out of a recognition, I think, of the fact that it is incredibly hard to change an entire society that has undergone a process of indoctrination over such a long period of time. We have our latest podcast. We have a podcast, if people didn't know. Our latest podcast episode is with an Israeli education scholar who has studied the Israeli education system, looking at textbooks systematically across the kind of sectors of the Jewish education system in Israel. The education system in Israel, by the way, is segregated between Jews and Palestinians. And what you see when you kind of systematically study these textbooks is that Palestinians basically don't exist, right? If they come up at all, they are Arabs and they're, part of the Arab world. They're not Palestinians. They have no distinct identity. This is what Israelis have been taught for decades. How do you change that? Like, you can't do it overnight. You can't even do it in a few years. This takes generations to overturn the processes that have been going on for such a long time. I would encourage people to listen to that podcast. But I think this is why we publish in English, because I think we don't have time to wait for Israeli society to change its mind.
I think we just forgot the question about whether West Bank's Jewish settlers would align with the AfD.
I think people on the far right in Israel would align with the far right everywhere. That's the reality. They will align with whoever will uphold their own project of supremacy. I think, I come from the UK where we see a far right that loves Israel, that loves Zionism, because it's essentially a model for an ethno-state, right? That's the sad reality. I think, we can go back historically to times when, far-right Zionist organizations before the establishment of the state were even interested in collaborating with Nazis or with fascists in the 30s because they had shared interests. I think there is never any sense among far-right Israelis or far-right Zionists that, maybe collaborating with these people is not great for the Jews. They don't care about that. They care about Israel. They care about their project of domination over Palestinians and over Palestine.
Okay, there was one question here in the front row, if it's still relevant. Yeah.
I would like to know more in detail how you work practically when you're doing your investigations. Where do you get your information from? What are your sources? How do you start an investigation? How do you choose the topic? Because I imagine that you are confronted with lots of closed doors when you need some information from state authorities, from ministries, and so this would be very interesting to hear from you, how you work every day.
I don't really see, because there's all right, okay, let's get James. And the person behind, yeah. And then that's, unfortunately, I think, the end.
Hi there. You spoke about your partnership with Local Call. I was wondering if you have any partnerships with Palestinian or Arabic news outlets, and if you have output in Arabic language as well.
Hi. I have kind of a follow-up question to what was discussed earlier about indoctrination. And I was wondering, how do you even engage in a discussion with people that you have absolutely no common moral ground with? And what is the perspective of what is to gain from such a discussion? It might seem a little bit silly, but I was wondering.
Okay, sorry, there was one more question here on the left. Ala just noted to me, so we'll get this one. That one, right? Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you. This relates to the question that was asked before about contacts with people, journalists maybe in Lebanon, if there's any possibility of being in touch with people over there where it's illegal to be in contact with people in Israel, if you're still trying to reach out to people via third countries, for example, or whatever. Thank you.
What do you want to start with?
Maybe I'll start with the investigations question.
Yeah.
So we have an incredible investigative reporter called Yuval Abraham, who some people might know also. He came here and premiered his film No Other Land at the Berlinale. He basically, we give him pretty much free rein to basically speak to people. He has a knack for getting people to talk to him inside the Israeli army, inside different kind of combat units and intelligence units in particular. And people talk to him. And by talking to people, he kind of starts to understand, what is the story here. And once he has a sense, usually he's one of those people that works on 10 stories at once, sometimes disappears for a year, comes back with 10 stories on our desk, and then we have to work out what to do with them. But what the process looks like is he'll be speaking to sources. He'll then work closely with editors, both at 972 and Local Call, to kind of finesse the investigation. One thing that we haven't touched on that maybe is relevant in this conversation is in Israel, media outlets have to submit articles that deal with national security issues to what's called the Israeli military censor. This is a body within the Israeli army which has kind of legal authority to either redact things from articles or kill an article entirely if it is deemed kind of damaging to national security. And the law gives it pretty free license to do that. This obviously affects our work because we generally through our investigations are trying to reveal new information about Israeli weapons or technology, things like that. We're also forbidden, it's worth saying, by law from revealing where the censor has interfered in our work. If we don't kind of follow these guidelines, we can be arrested, we can be fined severely, we can have our outlet shut down in the most severe case. 972 didn't always submit articles to the censor when it was founded, but after, I think it was 2016 or 2017, we received a letter, or the editors at the time received a letter directly from the chief censor saying if you don't kind of follow these rules, then we'll hit you with the full force of the law. So since then we have had to deal with the censor. It's a bizarre process that involves, being on the phone with a soldier who is looking at our investigation and saying, don't say that word, say this word instead. You're not allowed to reveal this fact, things like that. We then have to make a decision as a magazine whether or not it's kind of, the article still serves the public interest, right? If so much has been redacted from an article that it basically becomes a nothing burger, as Americans say. That is luckily not a situation we're in very often, but it can happen. And maybe it's worth saying just one more thing about the censor. We have no choice but to follow it, but we also try to push back on it in certain ways. One of those is that our executive director, Chagai Matar, every year submits a freedom of information request to the Israeli military in order to acquire information from the past year about how many articles it has interfered in, either by making redactions or by eliminating an article from publication altogether. And we publish that information on our website every year. You can have a look through our archives on that. Naturally, it's gone way up since October 7th because more media outlets are publishing more articles about national security issues. But that's one thing we can do. The other thing is that we, as we've mentioned, we have relationships with international media outlets who are not subject in the same way that we are to censorship. Now, when an international media outlet publishes information, even if it's something that the censor would have redacted, suddenly Israeli media outlets can report on it in the same way. So, if The Guardian publishes something, immediately we can publish the same thing and say, as written in The Guardian. It's a stupid, ridiculous thing that's completely absurd, but that's the reality that we have to deal with.
Yes, so our relationship with Local Call is more than a relationship, but 972 publishes Local Call, and the idea is again to try and reach the Israeli public where they are, and we've been very successful, to be honest. Like last year, Local Call was read by over 1 million people, and it's entirely in Hebrew, so we know these are 1 million Jewish Israelis out of 6 million Jewish Israelis. We have co-published with Arab outlets and Palestinian outlets in the past. It's a little sensitive simply because, again, emotions are high. Even if we comply with BDS, even if we are fighting for the liberation of the Palestinians, it's still a sensitive issue to a lot of media outlets, and we do our best to accommodate them. Also, this goes with the issue of people in Lebanon, for example, where it is against the law to deal with any entity that is in Israel, regardless of the nature of that entity. But we have had writers who just don't care and who want their voices to reach as many people as possible. And we have people who would rather publish under pseudonyms, which we are happy to do if it guarantees the safety of the person doing it. And we also rely on international writers and international reporters when it's appropriate.
So just a small addendum to that, we often also, our reporters will post, especially on social media, videos and like clips in Arabic, and we know that this goes fine. Actually, beyond that, one of our editors at Local Call and longtime contributors, Ori Noy, who's actually was born in Iran, and posted one of the most successful clips ever, which was like her speaking in Persian during the last war with Iran, and that kind of went really viral because a lot of people were looking for a dissenting Israeli voice talking about what Israel is doing in America, doing in Iran. And just to the question of like talking to people with like no similar moral ground, and what's the point of that? I mean, as Ben said, that the idea of the project of both websites from the beginning was to push for change, and BDS is meant to push for international pressure on the Israeli society, but that has to come from all sides. And I think we are all acknowledging that, yes, we must hold Israel accountable for its crimes. Yes, we must demand impunity to end, but we also need to think about what kind of society will there be after liberation. And I think we are all acknowledging that those people who are living between the river and the sea aren't going to go anywhere, both the Jews and Palestinians. So we need to keep thinking about what kind of society do we want to live in the next step of history, whenever that is. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do right now in Local Call. And it is frustrating, it's hard, but it's the only thing we can do, really.
It's already a wonderful ending. I just have one more question, because this is like the thing that's burning under my nails, and I couldn't sleep if I wouldn't ask. I'm exaggerating, but I thank you for mentioning the military censorship. I wanted to ask this as well, and I'm just like curious, since you elaborated on it now, like how come the censor lets you publish all these things? Do you have any sort of kind of hunch why, in the end of the day, still many things get published without the censor saying, no, we don't want that out there?
I mean, theoretically, the censor is not a political censor. It's a censor that, by law, is only allowed to interfere on issues of national security. I think, certainly we see political interference in some instances. I think, we get this question a lot, and it's not altogether clear necessarily why every article that we have published has been able to be published. I think on some level, we wonder sometimes if it's a case where the military is actually quite proud of this new, technology or new system, and is quite happy for it to be made public because it wants to start selling it to other regimes. That could be true. That obviously puts us in a strange position that we don't want to be in, where we're essentially, some people would accuse us of kind of doing PR for the Israeli army, which is absolutely not what we're doing. And if you read the articles in question, it's very clear from how we report on these things that it's incredibly critical. We're always focusing on the human rights aspect and bringing the voices of Palestinians who are subjected to these technologies and weapons. But I think ultimately, maybe it's a slight misconception in how the censorship works. It's not the government saying, we don't want this, and that to be made public. It's the army saying this doesn't serve our security, however they define that.
Well, I hope you can continue doing that work. It's vital, important, and especially here in Germany, something we really can't begin to express the degree to which we appreciate the things you guys are doing, and I really thank you for being here tonight. Maybe we can continue outside to discuss, but for now, thanks for being here.
much.